Today, we discuss how to know when to rebuild, when to push all in, how to identify what we're looking for in this decision making process, as well as what types of moves to make in both of these situations. Stick around for all that and more. So today is one of my favorite topics. Welcome into the Dyno Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Justin, joined as always by David and JP. We're talking some theory. We love talking theory, so we're very excited to get right into that. When to hold them, when to fold them, and when to walk away. So, David, go ahead and kind of start us off with that thought process on the biggest decision we have to make, right? Are we going to rebuild and just keep rebuilding? Are we pushing in? Should this contender think about stopping paying it forward on credit cards and moving into like a shorter rebuild as opposed to having to do like a nuclear rebuild if we hold on to it? What is our kind of thought process when we're in one of those situations where we're stressing out about all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think context is really important. So we'll add some of that here in a little bit. Just kind of some of the factors I look for, some of the early process. You got to start by assessing your options. Like, do you have a realistic playoff chance? Things you can look at. Obviously, your record tells you the most there because that's what gets you into the playoffs. But beyond that, your points for, your max points for, something that Sleeper shows pretty easily. I'm sure other sites do as well. That gives you an indication of whether you're actually scoring with the big guys or if you're just lucky. If you have access to or the patience to come up with all play data on your own, that's very useful. All play record is basically if you played everyone every week, what your record would be. So like say in a 12 team league, I had the third highest score. The two guys that scored higher than me would have beat me. Everybody else would have lost. My all play record for that week would be 9-2. This gives you a really good indication of where you sit in the league, but not everyone offers that readily. And it's kind of tedious to come up with. So, max points for is definitely a good sit in there. You consider how many teams are trying to contend. Is it going to be easy to sneak in the playoffs, or do you have like 8 or 9 people vying for those final spots? And then lastly, especially if you don't have the time or if you just want something to confirm what you've done, use an external source like Dynasty Daddy. They've got playoff probabilities for each league. Not perfect, like nothing in this game is, just a nice outside source to kind of let you know if you think you're on the right track or not there.
Now, David, a really important factor here is if you have your 2025 first or not. I know you had a situation where you were at least considering buying a first back where you didn't have a first, because I had it in that league. It makes it way easier, obviously, to fold them when you have your first, because you could sell some players and just try to aim for a top 4 pick and just, give up on the season, wave the white flag. But walk me through your thought process if you are on that fringe of the playoffs and you don't have your first.
I think this one comes down a little bit to your personality, honestly. If you're a little spiteful like me and I don't have my first, I don't want you to get a high pick out of that. I don't do it to the detriment of my team, but like in that league specifically, I kind of pushed all in at the startup to kind of push my process because I rarely ever do that. That was the first time I've ever done it. And in year 2, my team kind of looks like a disaster, but I've got enough pieces where I can see making the playoffs. I just don't have much flexibility. So I don't have a ton of pieces that are attractive to competitors because I'm getting by on cheap points here. I've got this week, what did I start? Like Tyrone Tracy, Justice Hill, Cam Akers, Dontavian Wicks, and Bo Melton. They're all in my lineup this week, but I'm winning. So I'm going to try to sneak into the playoffs there and see if I can get lucky. Maybe if I had some more pieces that I felt like I could get some future draft capital for, I might just go that direction and bite the bullet this year. But man, if you don't have your first, it's just so much harder to stomach the rebuild. Maybe you can pivot to some younger pieces and still be a fringe competitor, but it's definitely a huge factor for me as well.
How are you ninth in points for? I'm second in points for, and after this week, you're going to have a better record than me. I hate fantasy football.
Yeah, this league is weird for me because I don't normally have the luck, but I have the least points given up. My defense is just killing it. We got a good game plan every week. Defensive coordinators inspiring the boys. No, really, a lot of luck there for sure. I mean, I had Cousins as my bye week filler for Hurts. You heard some of the players I have in my lineup there. It is probably my least favorite team. I don't even really have the ammo to get my first back. So, like I said, I'm trying to survive. I've got TJ Hawkinson coming back soon. That should be good. AJ Brown coming back soon. Hopefully that should all help. But boy, it's not pretty. And this is definitely a good example for a team to assess because it's hard to assess that team.
I'm always a big proponent of taking as long as you can to make decisions. And when you don't own your first and your first is not attainable at a price that you're willing to stomach paying. The benefit is you don't have any incentive to make the decision sooner rather than later unless the deal is good. Because like if there's a deal that just like smacks you in the faces, you have to accept this deal. Like great offer. Holy smokes, I'm getting a bargain. Someone's paying a first for Cooper Cup or something like that. Like you're going to move him every time, right? Just for an example, I saw a deal where he practically got that valuation the other day. You got to accept that, right? But otherwise, if there's like someone's offering me a second for Cooper Cup, if I own my own first and I'm looking to push it, I might take that honestly at this point. But if I don't own my first and I have Cooper Cup and I'm thinking I can sneak into the playoffs, I'm probably holding him, right? Like, and if I decide I can't compete, can't make the playoffs, I'm probably waiting till as close to the trade deadline, if I have one, God forbid, I hate trade deadlines, to start making those deals because I don't have to worry about shedding max points, right? Like I'm still trying to see if I can squeeze or sneak my way into the playoffs no matter what my record is. And I have no incentive to shed points. So I do have one league like that, or if I took over, I don't have my first. And I'm just seeing if I can sneak in, even though I had a really bad start to the season. Don't make a decision, basically. Just wait on actually selling until as late in the season as you can, because I have no reason to shed the points. So it's not that you can't start tanking at a certain point, but just the only tanking you can really do is shedding points for future draft picks and younger players. So unless I get a really good deal, I'm just going to hold and try to do that late in the season if I decide I can't compete, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just a couple things I want to add there. First, if I can get a first for a veteran, like you said, obviously not cut probably unless you're adding to it, but if I can get a first that I feel should be valued around mine, I might be interested in getting that first and seeing if I can flip it to the guy who has my first. So that way I get control of my future back. You could also, if you decide that you think you're better than the team's first that you acquired, you can hang on to it. But especially with that specific team that we brought up as the example, if I could trade a different mid first and get mine back, I'd be thrilled. And then the last thing I just want to touch on there, do not trade your first 2 years out if you're in that situation, because then you're just going to be sitting another year of limbo and it's probably going to be
Sell it to
even
me.
uglier.
Sell it to me. Sell me that
Yeah.
first. I promise I have players that will fix your team.
You're buying
100%
it as a
guarantee.
very early first if you are. Moving on, other factors, other things. We pretty much talked about the things I consider when I'm looking at my playoff chances. If we don't like that, we're thinking about, can we rebuild? The first question is, do I have my first, like we just talked about? Another thing you got to consider, those, do you have impactful pieces that are useful to contenders? Are you actually going to be able to acquire more firsts or other useful things? Or are you just kind of, selling off random handcuffs for thirds or something on spike weeks? You still would want to do that, but it's a lot easier to go into a rebuild if you actually can get some momentum by selling guys like a Tyreek Hill or something, Saquon Barkley. And the last thing for a rebuild is how many other teams are selling and when did they start selling? Like, are they tanking? They've been buying up first for over a year and there's not many left. Just what is the market if you're going to rebuild? That's something you definitely want to consider. Another thing, another option you could be considering here is, do I just hold? I think for that, you've got to really consider what your answers to the first two, am I rebuilding or contending? You really want to know how old your core is. If you've got a really young core that's just performing better than you expected, but it's still kind of a year away, do I want to push in now or do I want to be patient? There's just a couple other things that kind of apply to all of these. How far into the season are we? You definitely don't want to make your decision too late. What's the rest of your season schedule look like? Did you have some easy matchups with your first 3 weeks where you're going to play those guys again, or are they tough matchups? And then what does your injury report look like? You got guys coming back that can help, or are you just stuck with what you got? Those are all things to look at, all things to consider when you're trying to pick a direction. I don't know if either of you guys have anything you want to add to that, though.
I mean, you pretty much nailed most of it, but I love talking. So I'll give it a whack. I really think my biggest philosophy is, as long as I can wait, I will. So I either like to have made my decision before the season has started, or, I mean, last year I had a team where like I lost Chubb week 1 and all my players just turned out to be pumpkins. And so I, after week 1, just full flipped, got my first back and tanked. But for the most part, if I haven't already assessed correctly in the off season and already started to push, the big thing you said for me that's the most important is, in almost every dynasty league I'm in, there's already a consolidation of all of the future draft picks to 3 or less teams for the majority of them, where you'll have a couple teams with 3 or 4 firsts each already next year. I mean, a couple of them, I'm that team, but it's hard to get in. So now if you're looking at a rebuild, you're looking at trying to acquire 2026 firsts at this point, right? And that's not as easy because you got to convince people to pay league dues, etc. for a lot of leagues, right? Not everyone's interested. If there's already people who've cornered the market on the rebuild the tank, if no one has done it yet, yeah, sure, I'm a lot more willing to rush into it. But if I've already identified a league where nobody's done it and I'm a team that could go either way and is in this situation, I probably already did it, basically, is kind of what I'm trying to say. So I like to hold. I like to get as much information. My big thing, and I was talking to Awesome Dumpling about this, our friend, yesterday or 2 days ago, and it was, if you're projected to win this week and you're not sure what to do with the team, like, I just want to see, do I win this week? And then just get more insight and more input. Like if it's like a 51% projected to win this week, I might be willing to try to make like a move. But if I'm like 65% chance to win this week against somebody, I'm probably just going to try to see what happens. See, do I get a little bit more insight? Does somebody else go 1-4 now who thought they were contending, and are there now cheaper pieces available? Unless something kicks me in the face is like, you have to try to take this deal, I always like to just wait and wait and wait, because every season people who thought they were competing are now selling assets that you can potentially buy cheaper. So there's always another chance to make that move. You might not get the player that you want, but you might get a player who is a point per game less than them, but a bit cheaper, right? Because they're a little bit older or something like that. So I really like to wait, to practice patience as much as possible this time of year. That being said, occasionally I make trades. Anyways, and when I do, a big situation that does happen is occasionally I like to trade away my future firsts. I don't always do it, but I probably have about half of them. Half of them I don't have, more or less. So when I trade away my future first, I am much more willing to, if I have a young core and I have the type of assets that I feel like I can reacquire value, I'm much more willing to trade other assets I have to push in. So usually when I trade my future first away, I have another future first that's not mine. And I'm making the bet by trading away my first, I like the other first more. So when I do this, I'm much more willing to move that other first. A little bit of it is like, I am very incentivized to make the playoffs because I gain nothing by missing the playoffs. So I'm more willing to push in earlier if things just haven't been hitting my way. So that is a situation where maybe it's a little bit of a sunk cost fallacy and I can't. I'll be damned if I'm going to let somebody get a better first. So I will push in. JP, tell me how dumb I am.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true, because you don't want to look back and say, darn, I traded the 102 and feel bad about it. You want to at least give yourself the shot to make the playoffs if you're not going to have that first and not be handing over an early draft pick for sure. I cannot blame you.
We're not always looking at teams where we're not sure if we should rebuild or not. Sometimes we have those teams where, holy smokes, I thought this team was kind of just young, some sexy names on it. I'd be kind of middling this year, and next year was when I was going to really hit my stride. But turns out this year seems to be my year so far. How do we kind of deal with those teams, JP?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an overperforming team and you have a winning record, I mean, you might just want to write it out. If you're still kind of feeling like you're on the playoff fringe, I mean, you can really evaluate, like, okay, am I just overperforming early in the season? And the easiest way to identify that is if you have a team that you know you're top 6 in record, but in points scored, you're not. Maybe you're ninth in points scored, and you're sitting with a winning record, or just barely you're 3-3. But I mean, if you're sitting in that spot though, and you still have CMC, Puka Nakua, AJ Brown returning soon, that's completely fine, because sure, you might be a little bit below average in points for, but those guys are going to give you a huge boost. Maybe some other guys have gained value since they've been scoring some good points for you. But another way to identify that if you are overperforming, I mean, you can look back at your schedule from the first 5 or 6 weeks. If you played a bunch of rebuilders, it's like, okay, that's why I'm 3-2, and maybe I cannot stack up with the big dogs. But outside of just simply looking at points and records, just the stats, I mean, you could look at some players that we identify are overperforming and don't think that they can be relied on as heavily later in the season. I mean, some of those guys, Baker Mayfield, he's been fantastic, right? He's QB2 so far. He's on pace for 44 total touchdowns, but I struggle to see him being a top 3 quarterback at the end of the season. Still a good player, and he's definitely risen in value. But another guy, Justin Fields, he's been a QB1 in points per game so far, but there's no guarantee that he's even going to be the starter in a few weeks. They've lost 2 straight games at this point. They could still turn to Russell Wilson. So if he's your QB2 and you don't really have another great option, that might be, another signal that maybe you won't making a push for the championship. Chuba Hubbard, he started out slow, but lately he's been on fire with Andy Dalton being the quarterback there. But with Jonathan Brooks coming, you might not be able to rely on him because he's going to be in a split backfield. And the last one I'm going to point out is Jordan Mason. I mean, that's pretty obvious with CMC being out. You don't expect Jordan Mason to be a guy that you can rely on heading it, the second half of the season.
You're muted.
Yeah, if you're relying on one of those guys, like you've been getting some points from Jordan Mason, I'm okay with expecting, like, especially if we're roster constructing how we want to, where you have a bunch of those backup running backs, right? You have like the Tank Bigsby, Zach Charbonnet type sitting on your bench. Maybe you've even gotten some spot starts from some of those guys for bye weeks, etc. But that you just can believe that either maybe you're lucky and Jordan Mason is still an asset, CMC doesn't return, or maybe someone else gets injured, because someone else will get injured, right? If you have 12 running backs on your bench, like we kind of ideally want to on our competitive teams, to be able to try to plug those guys in, right? Then like I'm willing to like be okay with like one of those guys. But if it's a team where if you recognize 3 of these names on your team, that's a really good sign, right? If it's just one, you can try to work around that, build around that. And if you make it into the playoffs and you have some liquid assets, you could buy somebody closer to the playoffs, right? But this is a really big point, especially if having those names couples with what JP mentioned, right? You see, you've been starting Chuba Hubbard and Jordan Mason, and you're 8th in points for, and your toughest matchups are still yet to come, right? Like if you and you don't have any injured players returning, right? Like if these things start to stack on each other, especially, it's a really good sign. Like 1 or 2 of those signs, even like 1 sign is like you can maybe ignore it. 2 signs is a yellow light. 3 of those signs, that's a red flag where you really want to truly just, keep an eye. Are they compounding? Is it more than 1? Would be my big take on that. David, anything to add on that?
It just kind of depends on where you're at overperforming, right? You could be undefeated, you could have 1 loss, but maybe you're not quite scoring with the big dogs. Maybe you just need to fill like a hole or 2, and then you could be. So that's probably the direction I would head in that situation. But most likely, if you're an overperforming team, you probably don't have a great roster. In that case, the first question, I kind of go back to the rebuild questions I was asking. Do I have my first, or can I get my first at least? If I have my first and I feel like I'm overperforming, I don't really care what my record is. Probably time to start selling, to be honest.
Especially because you have assets that you can probably get more than what you'd consider their face value to be because they are overperforming, right?
Correct. Yeah, especially like a Jordan Mason or something before his window closes. In these cases, you probably don't need to strip it to the studs. Obviously, if you're winning, weeks, then you have some skilled players on there. You have some decent players, but definitely try to sell the older players, sell the guys with the short windows. And, there's nothing wrong with setting up your team for next year if you can't compete. You just got to be honest with yourself about it, though.
And in this situation too, if you are 3-2, or maybe it's after week 6 and you're 3-3, and you don't have your first, I mean, you probably don't have to pay early first prices at that point because, yeah, sure, maybe you trying to get your first back is an indicator like I'm trying to rebuild, but also you can sell it as like, hey, I mean, I could easily make the playoffs here, and I could spite you. So yeah, I think at that point it gives you a little bit more leverage in getting your first at a more of a mid first price as opposed to an early first. So I think that is something you want to consider as well.
So let's move on to our next kind of team. David, can you tell us how we identify an underperforming team besides just looking up my teams on Dynasty-daddy.com? Everything is fine.
I mean, that is a solid place to start. It's a great resource for all of these situations. Yeah, underperforming teams typically have had some bad luck. Maybe you've got some bad injuries. Maybe you've just gone up against opponents that have had huge weeks. Maybe you've made poor lineup decisions. The main thing here is to determine, like, can I actually make the playoffs? Is there enough time? And you really, again, you have to be honest with yourself. Don't assume that the luck's going to flip all the way around and you're going to have great luck from here on out, but probably fair to assume average luck when you're thinking about this. Time in the season has a lot to do with it. Is there enough time left that I can overcome however many people are ahead of me? Am I scoring enough to where I think that I could compete if I do make the playoffs? Do I have people coming back from injury? Those are all really important. Rest of season schedule is important. Do I have any easy wins in front of me, or are they all going to be tough? The main thing, obviously, for this is, am I scoring more than my record? And if I am, how do I want to handle that? Do I think I can make a playoff push, or do I just chalk up this season to bad luck and start positioning myself for next year?
And of course, when you're looking at this, I think this is going to sound redundant, right? Do you have your first? Are other teams already tanking, et cetera, right? There's so many of those same types of processes. Go back to that earlier timestamp. Listen to the how do you know when it's time to rebuild bit, right? And consider all those things again, right? And of course, that kind of goes without saying at this point, right? We're not going to rebuild unless we are in a situation to rebuild. So many of those other things kind of come into play again here.
If you're in a 1-4, 1-5 hole, I think it's a really, really hard uphill battle because you have to almost go undefeated the rest of the season. At that point, I might just wave the flag unless I really, really have no other choice. But if you're 2-3 and you're getting AJ Brown back, maybe you have Pacheco as well, and you know that if you get in the playoffs, that you're at least going to be one of the top 3-4 teams and have a shot. I mean, if you have a little bit of flexibility, maybe you can even add an extra piece, to help you. But I mean, AJ Brown's coming back this week. I mean, do you guys feel the same way? Where's that line? Is it 2-3, 2-4, where you're still willing to, if you're getting back a hammer or two?
Yeah, when I have a team that's underperforming, what I will honestly do is I will go through week by week and I will be honest with myself. Like, is this a game I'm guaranteed to win, right? Because there's probably 4 to 5 games the rest of the season in any dynasty league you feel like you're pretty much guaranteed to win because maybe you're playing a rebuilder. Maybe you see like, oh my God, they only have 2 quarterbacks and both of them are on bye this week or something, right? As you go through and you look at that. And like, I do an honest assessment, like, how many games am I guaranteed to win? Are there any games that I don't feel like there's any way I'm going to win? And then how many games are there that are toss-ups, and assume I win 50% of those. Look at my record after that. Is that a record I expect to make the playoffs? I do a very like logical assessment of it. Of course, I compare that with Dynasty Daddies and other websites playoff like percentages, right? Does what I think match up with those? If what I think matches up with those and I have a decent chance of still sneaking in because I have a solid team, I'll take that as some confirmation bias to kind of stick it out. But there's that big kind of self-assessment that I like to do there where I literally look through week by week by week in that sort of manner. That is probably honestly my biggest factor in deciding what that line is, and maybe second biggest factor, because the first biggest factor is just our teams 9 through 4 pretty much inseparable. Like, are there 4 3-2 teams and 2 2-3 teams in that mess, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that? Because if that's the case and I have like close to the highest in points for in that group, I'm probably just going to chalk it up to I'm probably going to give it at least one more week. Like I said so far, I like to try to push off that decision unless I'm playing one of the super teams this week, like, because that could change my opinion, but I'm probably looking at keeping going and trying to hold.
Probably your biggest bullet in this situation, if you've decided you're underperforming, but you want to go for it, if you have your first, you probably want to sell it while your record is bad, because you might be able to sell it as an early first, even if you know in your head you're going to go for it. That's a bold decision, because if your bad luck continues, you might be giving away an early first. That's also something that can turn things around for you, because you might be able to sell it overvalued.
It's a bold move, Cotton. We'll see how it pays off. No, absolutely. We do want to caution you when you're selling your early first, make sure you did those assessments that we're talking about, right? Make sure you go through and you see, like, obviously you might be thinking about it a little bit differently, right? You might be saying, like, with player X that you're buying with your first, what do I think about my ability to win these matchups going forward, right? But also remember, player X can get injured. So, like, make sure that player X isn't like you're counting on them, right? Make sure that it's like, I have player X, but I also like feel like I could probably make the playoffs without them, but with them I'm a real contender now, is probably more what we're looking for. Not with player X I can sneak into the playoffs. We're definitely not trying to sell our future first to sneak into the playoffs, but that's a really good point. Feel free to also, if you ask in the comments below, like, we will, if you share your URL of your sleeper team, your sleeper username, I'll take a look at Dynasty Daddy with the boys and look at your league, and we'll actually get back to you on whether or not we think it's worth pushing in. So feel free to ask those trade questions in the comments below as well. We will give you thoughtful, in-depth responses on them. So let's move on to our next kind of team. JP, can you tell us how you can identify a team that is good but not a true championship contender?
I think it's circling back to a lot of what we have said with Mac, the points for that you've scored on the season. I think that's a strong indicator. I mean, sometimes you just have to look at the league landscape, because a lot of times you will have 2 or 3 teams that are just crushing it, and maybe you're only you're 4th place in the league, but just looking at the state of their team and how many points they've scored for the season, you might still have quite a gap. Which in that scenario, I mean, you probably want to buy. If you're in that playoff hunt, you want to be able to compete with them. Of course, you don't want to mortgage too much of your future. Yeah, I just think that if I'm in the playoffs, I want to feel like I have a good shot to at least take down the big dogs as well. You don't even have to get somebody that's super expensive. I'm pretty sure, David, was it Joe Flacco? Did you use him in our Megala Dynasty in your playoff?
Yeah, I did buy him off of you before the deadline as a depth piece, and he ended up starting a week for me.
You don't exactly need to do that and make that move right now. Of course, the trade deadline is going to be really important in this scenario. But is there any other tips you guys have for if you're on the cusp? You're going to make the playoffs, but you're on the cusp of being a true championship contender. What kind of moves are you guys making?
I kind of view this two ways. If I, like we've talked about a little before, if my roster I feel like is a year away and we're putting stuff together, we're making a little run, I'm going to be a little cautious about moving, mortgaging future assets to make a push this year. There's so much variance. Like, I don't want to risk my future, potentially a future powerhouse for a single playoff run. Actually, in the league you just brought up, I did buy Chase the first year because I was in that situation. I went for a productive struggle and snuck into the playoffs. Thought, Chase came onto the trade block right before the deadline. Thought maybe I could buy him. And if I win this year, great. But if not, I still have Jamar Chase. So that worked out pretty well for me. I did not win that year, but I have Jamar Chase. And the other one is, do I think my championship window actually has an expiration date? Because in that case, I'm going to be a lot more aggressive. I still don't want to mortgage my future. I don't want to end up like I'm in my situation in the Degens league where we brought up earlier in the episode where I don't have my first. But man, chances at a championship don't come around too often. So if your roster's getting a little older, I'm going to try to buy a piece or two. I'm okay trading my picks for that off season, just not the one and I'll 2 off seasons out.
For me, of course, I've previously been beating this like a dead horse. I want to wait as long as possible, right? Like, unless there's a solid offer. But if I feel like it's time to make a move, what am I looking to do? So let's go with the situation David was talking about, where I feel like I have a team that's really going to hit its stride the following season. Basically, I capped my expenditures at that point as I will move future seconds potentially for like older people that I consider to be a hammer, or like a deal that I made on a team that kind of fits that. I'm very young all the way around. Is I traded Blake Corum for Aaron Jones because I feel like Aaron Jones, RIP, before his injury midway through the game was looking like a hammer type of player, right? And I still think when he comes back healthy, of course, Aaron Jones, you always expect him to miss some games. Just historically, David knows as a Packers fan. But I'm looking to maybe move underperforming rookies to a other team that's looking to go the other direction, who's looking to take. But on those teams where I feel like I'm young, I'm not looking to make big moves. I'm looking to buy older one season rentals that I don't have to overpay for. So I'll ask for every single player in that category, right? Mike Evans, Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, Derrick Henry, guys that are, there's only probably one season left. You're not even sure if they'll make it through this season, but that you feel it can give you hammer production. Those are my big type of directions I'm looking to go. But as long as I'm projected to win this week, or conversely, if buying that player doesn't make me the favorite this week, then I'm probably looking to be patient. Now, the other ones are teams where like David said, I feel like I have to push in. When I feel like I have to push in because my championship window is not very long, I kind of go the other way, that I'm not looking for the older pieces as much, but then I'm looking for the younger pieces so that I can maybe see if I can try to extend out my championship window a little bit. Because like if instead I can get a 27-year-old wide receiver instead of a 30-year-old wide receiver for approximately the same price, even if they're not quite as much of a hammer, maybe it's bad process. Maybe I should just go for the hammer, but I usually will try to go the other direction a little bit right there and just get a little bit younger of an asset to see if I can just counterbalance this roster that I feel like is aging out a little bit, because I don't want to push in with those older assets. Because when you have that older roster, moving a second is a lot bigger deal than when you have a younger roster, to be honest with you, because you're old.
If you are trying to buy, a lot of times it is around that trade block time when they are a little bit cheaper to get those guys like a Mike Evans or a Derrick Henry, somebody like that. So I think that, like you said, Justin, I think just waiting, especially up until that trade block, is just the best advice that you can really take right now.
I really wish I had the I don't know why, but like on the Giphy, how do you say it? The GIF app on Sleeper, GIF. Anyways, you can't find the Aaron Rodgers relax GIF. And I really want to be able to send that to people more often when they're asking trade questions, because I do feel like the majority of the time, relax is the right answer, 100%. Moving on to the last situation, which is how do we identify when we actually are that true championship contender? because I have to tell you, sometimes I am a little bit guilty of lying to myself. Don't know how it happened. I'm just really convincing, I guess, because I convince myself a lot of the times about things that are not true. So, David, how do I avoid doing that? How do I actually know when I really am a contender at this point in the season?
I mean, it starts with being honest with yourself, which for you, I know might be an issue. But look, these teams are probably the easiest to identify. You probably admire this roster a lot. You've got a great record. You're one of the highest scorers every week. It should be pretty obvious, I guess is the easiest way to put it. If it's not obvious, maybe you're not a true contender. The biggest thing that I want to talk about here with this kind of team is you're just trying to set yourself up for a playoff run. So the first thing you want to think about is there a trade deadline? If there's no trade deadline, then as long as you've got some flexibility and some depth, you can kind of just ride it out and plug holes as they come up. If there is a trade deadline though, you almost got to assume the worst at times. Like we were just talking about, I bought Joe Flacco last year. It was like a third or something, and I didn't need him. I had 3 quarterbacks. I ended up needing him to win my championship, and it helped me win the championship. So, it's definitely a different approach, but the trade deadline is the big piece for me here. I don't know about you guys, but
Why did you buy him? I wanted that championship.
because I wanted the championship.
Yeah, absolutely. The trade deadline is a big deal. One piece of advice on that and on like this whole idea of waiting is, especially if you've been in a dynasty league, the same dynasty league with the same guys for a few years, usually you can start to feel out how people play, right? So like a little strategy piece, and we'll talk about this probably later on in the season. I think it'd be a good episode to do a few weeks before the trade deadline. But just knowing, like, are these people going to charge you a premium right at the trade deadline, or are they going to be rational and make moves that are in their team's best interest? Because a lot of times people want to charge a tax. The same thing as if there's not a trade deadline and you are actually at the playoffs window. I personally, if I'm not in the playoffs, I'm not giving anyone a great deal, right? Like, I'm not trying to hand anyone a championship, but I'll sell people for cash value, maybe a shade below cash value if they're an expiring asset, because Cooper Kupp isn't going to do anything next year for me, or at least I don't think he is. So like, I'll take a second for him then, which maybe I wouldn't have taken at the beginning of the season, right? Like, but not everyone is like that. Sometimes people are like, you're going to win a championship, pay me a first for this guy. So if you can just like feel out those situations, that does definitely really change when you should be patient and when you should push in. Because if you know people will begrudgingly like just not be logical near the trade deadline, near the playoff, that is really something to try to keep in mind, kind of that human aspect of dynasty. That's something I think is really important to pay attention to as well. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Dyno Construction Podcast. We hope our long-winded tangents and speeches and telling you to be patient and relax were as helpful for you as it was for us. Please remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen or view. And from all of us here at the Dyno Construction Podcast, until next time.